Don't waste my time, Daniel Brooks said without even looking up, his voice cutting through the polished quiet like a door already closing. And when Naomi Carter stepped forward into the glass-walled showroom, the late afternoon sun slid across the marble floor and caught on her shoes, worn but clean, steady, unmoving, while inside the room deals worth millions hovered in the air like something sacred, something protected, something not meant for her, at least not in his mind, because Daniel finally looked up and let his eyes travel slowly, deliberately, from her face to her hands to the simple bag at her side. And the faint smile that followed wasn't warm. It was practiced, dismissive, the kind that had ended conversations before they even began. Listings in this area start at 3 million, he added, tapping a glossy brochure against the table as if that number alone could push her back out the door. But Naomi didn't move, not even an inch, her gaze drifting past him instead, past the polished desk, past the smiling clients signing documents, as if she was studying the room from a distance no one else could see. And for a second something flickered across Daniel's face. Not doubt, not yet, just irritation, the kind that comes when expectations aren't met, when someone refuses to play their assigned role. You should probably check the listings a few miles south, he said, sharper now, gesturing vaguely toward the street like he was doing her a favor, like he was guiding her back to where she belonged. But Naomi stepped forward instead, her heels clicking once, twice, the sound small, but somehow louder than the low hum of conversation around them. And the room shifted, just slightly, a few heads turning, a few voices lowering, curiosity threading through the air. She stopped at the edge of his desk, close enough now that the reflection of the city skyline behind him caught in her eyes, steady, unblinking. And when she spoke, her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It was calm, precise. I asked to see the property on Maple and 3rd, she said, each word placed carefully, like something measured, and Daniel let out a short laugh, the kind meant for the room, not for her, inviting agreement, inviting distance. That property isn't available to just anyone, he replied, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled like he had already decided how this would end, like the script had been written long before she walked in. And somewhere behind Naomi a pen stopped moving, a signature left unfinished, the air tightening without anyone saying why, because she still hadn't moved, hadn't argued, hadn't raised her voice, just stood there in the light, letting the silence stretch long enough to become uncomfortable, long enough to make people notice it. And Daniel shifted, just slightly, the smile fading at the edges as the room waited for something, anything, to break. But Naomi didn't rush. She reached slowly into her bag, the soft sound of paper brushing against paper barely audible, and for the first time, Daniel's eyes followed the movement, not because he wanted to, but because something in it didn't match what he expected, something quiet, controlled, deliberate, and the sunlight caught the edge of the folder as she brought it up, resting it gently on the desk between them, not sliding it, not pushing it, just placing it there like it had always belonged, and the room, already quiet, seemed to hold its breath just a second longer than it should have. Daniel did not touch the folder right away, his fingers hovering just above it as if the paper itself carried weight he had not agreed to hold. And the room, once filled with low, confident chatter, had shifted into something thinner, quieter, like air before a storm that no one could quite name. I think there has been a misunderstanding, he said finally, straightening slightly in his chair, his voice smoother now, but tighter at the edges, as if recalibrating, as if searching for ground that still belonged to him. But Naomi did not respond. She simply stood there, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture neither defensive nor aggressive, just present, and that presence pressed against the room in a way that made people look twice, not because she demanded attention, but because she did not ask for it. And Daniel cleared his throat, letting out a short breath before placing his palm lightly on the folder, sliding it an inch closer to himself, the motion controlled, deliberate, like he was still in charge of how this unfolded. He opened it slowly, expecting numbers, maybe a loan pre-approval, something to confirm what he already believed, something to justify the dismissal he had already delivered. But the first page was not what he expected, and his eyes paused, just for a fraction longer than they should have, scanning lines of print that did not fit the narrative he had already built, legal language, signatures, property maps, the The faint blue outline of streets he knew well, streets he had sold, walked, memorized, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. These documents, he began, but his voice did not carry the same certainty now. It thinned slightly, like it had lost something on the way out. Naomi watched him without interruption, her gaze steady, not challenging, not forgiving, just there, and behind her, someone shifted in their chair. Another leaned forward just enough to see the edge of the page. Curiosity no longer hidden, Daniel flipped to the next sheet. Then another, the quiet sound of paper turning filling the space where his confidence used to sit, and the numbers began to align in ways he could not ignore. Parcel identifiers, ownership transfers, dates that stretched back years, each line building something he could feel before he fully understood it. And for the first time since she walked in, he did not look at her as a disruption. He looked at her as a question he did not yet know how to answer. "Where did you get this?" he asked. But the question lacked edge. It came out softer, almost cautious, and Naomi's response was simple, almost weightless. "From the source," she said. And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that made no one speak. Daniel flipped one more page, slower now, as if giving himself time to reinterpret what he was seeing. But the information did not change, it only clarified. And somewhere deep in the structure of his certainty, something began to shift, not collapse, not yet, but bend, and the sunlight that had once framed Naomi now stretched across the desk, touching the open folder, illuminating the ink, the signatures, the reality sitting in front of him. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, closer than before, as if proximity might give him control again. But it did not, because the more he read, the more the room seemed to move around him, voices fading further, attention narrowing. The space between him and Naomi no longer defined by distance, but by something else entirely, something he could not dismiss, not anymore. Daniel's eyes stopped on a single line, and this time they did not move, not because he had finished reading, but because he had finally understood what he was looking at. The name printed there, clean and undeniable. Naomi Carter, listed not once but repeatedly, across parcels, across addresses he knew by memory, each one a property he had either sold, tried to sell, or failed to access without approval. And the realization did not arrive loudly. It crept in, slow and heavy, settling into his chest like something that did not belong there. His fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the paper, the crisp surface bending just enough to show the tension he could no longer hide. And for the first time since she walked in, he did not look like the man in control of the room. He looked like someone catching up to a moment that had already passed him. These are acquisitions," he said, but the statement sounded uncertain, like he was asking the room to confirm it for him. And no one did, because no one knew how to step into what was unfolding. The clients at the table had stopped pretending to review their contracts, their attention drawn fully now. The assistant near the back had lowered her tablet, eyes fixed on the open folder, and Naomi remained exactly where she had been, not moving forward, not stepping back, just allowing the silence to do its work, allowing him to reach the conclusion on his own, because anything said too soon would have softened the impact. And this moment required clarity, not comfort. Daniel flipped another page, slower now, almost careful, like each movement carried consequence. The map expanded, showing block lines, boundaries, sections of the neighborhood marked in faint gray, and then highlighted in blue, and his breath caught, just slightly, as the pattern became impossible to ignore. It was not one property, not two, it was the entire stretch, the very block he had just refused to show her, the same block he had guarded with quiet authority, the same block he believed he controlled access to. And the irony did not need to be spoken. It filled the space between them, visible in the way his shoulders shifted, in the way his posture no longer leaned back, but forward, drawn in, contained. "You are saying you are the owner," he said, and this time it was a question, stripped of its earlier confidence. And Naomi met his gaze directly, her voice even, measured. "I am saying the paperwork speaks for itself," she replied, and the words landed with a precision that left no room for reinterpretation. Daniel glanced down again, searching for something to contradict it, something to restore the structure he had relied on. But every line he read confirmed the same truth, the dates aligned, the signatures verified, the legal stamps unmistakable, and somewhere behind him, A door opened, footsteps approached quickly, not rushed but urgent, and a man in a tailored suit entered the room. His expression shifting the moment he saw Naomi, recognition flashing across his face before he even spoke. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone respectful, steady. "We have been trying to reach you about the final documentation for the development," and the room stilled. Completely, because the confirmation did not come from her. It came from someone else, someone who carried authority in a way Daniel understood instantly, and Daniel's hand, still resting on the folder, slowly lifted away as if the paper no longer belonged to him, as if it never had. And in the reflection of the glass wall behind Naomi, the skyline stood tall and unmoving, but inside the room, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The man in the tailored suit did not wait for permission to step further into the room, his presence alone shifting the balance in a way no one could ignore, and Daniel instinctively straightened, not out of confidence, but reflex, the kind that comes when someone recognizes authority greater than their own. "We were expecting you this afternoon," the man continued, his tone measured but respectful, directing every word toward Naomi, not Daniel, not the clients, only her. And Naomi gave a small nod, calm, unhurried, as if this moment had always been part of her schedule, not a disruption, not an accident, just a delay corrected. And Daniel's eyes moved between them, trying to realign the narrative, trying to understand where he had lost control of it. But the pieces no longer fit the way he had arranged them. "There must be some confusion," Daniel said, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, his voice careful now, almost cautious. "We handle all transactions on this block," and the man in the suit turned to him, not dismissive, not confrontational, just direct. "You handle listings," he replied, a slight emphasis on the word that drew a clear line between roles. Ownership is already established, and the distinction landed heavier than anything spoken before, because it did not challenge Daniel's position. It redefined it entirely, reducing it, clarifying it, placing it somewhere smaller than he had believed, and the room absorbed it in silence, the clients exchanging brief glances, the assistant lowering her gaze, as if witnessing something they were not meant to interrupt, and Daniel's hand moved to the edge of the desk, fingers pressing lightly against the polished surface, grounding himself in something solid, something familiar. "If that is the case," he said slowly, choosing each word with care now, "then perhaps we should have been informed." And Naomi finally shifted, just slightly, not stepping closer but lifting her chin a fraction, enough to meet his eyes fully. "You were," she said, her voice even, steady, just not directly. And the meaning settled in without explanation, because it did not need one. The information had existed, the ownership had been documented, the truth had been present, it simply had not been seen, and Daniel's gaze flickered, not away, but inward, searching through memory, through meetings, through emails he may have skimmed, through details he may have dismissed because they did not fit the pattern he expected. And the realization did not come with a single moment. It came in layers, each one quieter than the last, until the only thing left was the absence of certainty he once held, and the man in the suit placed a second folder beside the first, the soft sound echoing slightly in the stillness. "These are the final approvals for the redevelopment," he said, addressing Naomi again. "We only need your signature to proceed." And Daniel glanced at the folder, then back at Naomi, the shift in perspective now complete, because moments earlier he had been the gatekeeper, the one deciding access, and now he stood at the edge of a decision that did not belong to him at all. And Naomi reached forward, her movements unhurried, deliberate, the pen offered to her catching a line of sunlight as she took it, and for a brief second, the reflection in the glass behind her aligned perfectly, the skyline, the light, the room, all framing a moment that no one spoke about but everyone understood, and Daniel remained still, not because he chose to, but because there was nothing left for him to do except witness the reality he had failed to recognize, unfolding clearly, undeniably, right in front of him. The pen did not touch the paper immediately, Naomi holding it just above the signature line, as if measuring the weight of the moment rather than the ink itself, and the sunlight that stretched across the desk caught the metallic edge, casting a thin reflection that trembled slightly with the movement of her hand. while the room remained completely still, no one daring to interrupt. No one willing to speak into something that had already shifted beyond their control, and Daniel stood there, just a few feet away, yet farther from the center of the room than he had ever been. His shoulders no longer squared with confidence, but held in a quiet tension he could not disguise. His eyes fixed on the document, as if reading it again might change what it meant, but it did not. The lines remained the same, clear, precise, final, and Naomi lowered the pen. The soft scratch of ink against paper breaking the silence in a way that felt louder than it should have, deliberate, steady, each letter forming without hesitation, without pause. And when she finished, she did not rush to lift the pen. She let it rest there for a fraction of a second longer, sealing the moment not just in ink but in presence, before setting it down gently beside the folder. And the man in the tailored suit nodded once, respectful, acknowledging not just the signature but the authority behind it. "We will move forward immediately," he said, his voice calm but firm. Already shifting into action, already treating her decision as the axis around which everything else would turn, and he gathered the documents with careful precision, not hurried, not careless, as if handling something that required attention, something that mattered. And Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his gaze lifting from the desk to Naomi, searching for something, perhaps a chance to reframe what had just happened, perhaps a way to step back into the role he had occupied just minutes ago. But there was no opening, no space left for that version of him to exist in this room. "Not anymore, Ms. Carter," he began, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier edge, carrying something closer to recognition than authority. "If there was any misunderstanding earlier," he paused, choosing his words with care, aware now that every sentence carried weight he had not considered before. It was not intentional, and the statement hung there, not as an excuse, not fully as an apology, but as something unfinished, something still forming. And Naomi looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm clarity that did not need to be raised to be understood. "You made a decision based on what you saw," she said, her tone even, unhurried, "not based on what was true." And the distinction settled deeper than any accusation could have, because it did not attack, it revealed, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in defense but in acknowledgement, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to argue, nothing left to correct, only something to understand. And the room, still quiet, seemed to expand again, the tension shifting into something else, something more reflective, more aware. And Naomi reached for her folder, closing it with a soft, final motion, her fingers brushing lightly across the cover as she gathered it. And when she turned toward the door, the path in front of her opened without a word, people stepping aside instinctively, not out of obligation but recognition. And Daniel remained where he was, watching as she moved through the space he once controlled, the sunlight following her across the floor, leaving him standing in the shadow of a moment he had failed to see coming, a moment that had been there all along. The glass door closed softly behind Naomi, the faint click barely audible against the hum of the city outside. And for a moment the showroom did not move, it did not breathe, it simply held the shape of what had just happened, as if the air itself needed time to settle. And Daniel remained where he stood, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface of the desk, a version of himself that looked the same but felt different, quieter, less certain. And the sunlight that had followed her now stretched across the empty space she had left behind, illuminating nothing but absence. And he looked down at his hands, still resting on the edge of the desk, the same hands that had dismissed her just minutes earlier, the same hands that had pointed her toward another neighborhood without a second thought. And now they felt unfamiliar, as if disconnected from the decisions they had made. And around him the room slowly began to return. A chair shifted, a pen tapped lightly against paper. Someone cleared their throat, but the rhythm was different, more cautious, more aware, like a conversation that had learned something it could not unlearn. And Daniel exhaled again, longer this time, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that does not arrive with noise, but with weight. And he turned his head toward the glass wall, watching as Naomi stepped out onto the sidewalk, her figure moving through the reflection of the skyline, blending with it, not overshadowed by it but aligned with it in a way that made the boundary between them seem thinner than it had before, and a car slowed near the curb, the driver stepping out quickly to open the door for her, a gesture small but precise, practiced, respectful, and she paused for just a second before getting in, her gaze lifting briefly toward the building, not searching, not lingering, just acknowledging, and then she was gone, the door closing, the car merging into the flow of traffic like it had always belonged there. And Daniel watched until it disappeared, not because he needed to, but because something in him had not yet caught up to the moment. And when he finally turned back, the room felt different, not because the walls had changed or the light had shifted, but because the way he saw it had, every detail sharper now, every assumption less certain. And the folder still lay on the desk, open, the pages slightly misaligned from where he had turned them too quickly, and he reached out, not with urgency, but with care, straightening them, smoothing the edges as if restoring order to something that had been disrupted. But the gesture did not bring back what he had lost. It only reminded him of it. And he closed the folder slowly, the soft sound final, contained, and for a moment he stood there, holding it, feeling the weight of what he had overlooked, what he had chosen not to see, and the realization settled deeper, not as regret alone, but as something more lasting, something that would remain long after the room returned to normal, because it was no longer about a missed opportunity or a lost sale. It was about a moment that had revealed the limits of how he judged, how he decided, how he defined who belonged and who did not, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of understanding that had arrived too late to change what had happened, but just in time to change what would come next. The room did not return to what it was, even as voices slowly came back and chairs shifted into place, because something invisible had settled into the space, something that changed how every movement felt, and Daniel noticed it in the smallest details, the way the assistant avoided meeting his eyes, the way the client spoke more quietly, more measured, as if aware that what had just happened was not just a transaction, but a moment that redefined who held real authority. And he placed the folder down carefully, no longer treating it like paperwork, but like evidence, not of ownership, but of his own blind spot. And he stepped away from the desk, the polished floor reflecting his movement in sharp lines, each step slower than the last, as if the weight of the realization followed him, not dragging him down, but keeping him grounded. And he paused near the glass wall, looking out at the street where everything continued as usual, cars passing, people walking, the rhythm of the city unchanged. And yet for him it was not the same, because he could no longer separate what he saw from what he had missed. And behind him, one of the clients finally spoke, not to him but to the room. "She owns the entire block." The words quiet but clear, and no one corrected it. No one softened it, because it was not an exaggeration, it was a fact that now lived in the open. And Daniel turned slightly, hearing it fully this time, not as information but as context, and it reshaped everything that came before, every word he had said, every assumption he had made. And the memory replayed not as a blur, but in sharp detail, her standing at the door, the light catching her silhouette, the calm in her voice when she asked for the property on Maple and 3rd, the way she had not raised her tone even when dismissed. And he understood now that the power in that moment had never been his. It had only seemed that way because he was used to being believed, used to being followed, used to defining the narrative before anyone else had a chance to speak. And he let out a breath, slower this time, not to release tension but to acknowledge it, to accept that what he thought he controlled had never been fully his to control. And the realization did not come with panic or urgency. It came with clarity, sharp and quiet, the kind that does not fade once it arrives. And he walked back toward the desk, not to reclaim it, but to stand in front of it differently, his posture no longer projecting certainty but awareness. And he looked at the spot where the folder had been opened, where her signature had marked the shift, and for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that could change what had already unfolded. And yet something in him moved, not outward, not for the room, but inward, a recalibration, subtle but permanent. And the room, sensing the shift without naming it, continued around him, but not the same way, not with the same assumptions. And Daniel stood there in that space between what he had been and what he now understood, realizing that the difference between the two was not time, it was perspective, and once it changed, it did not go back. The rest of the afternoon moved forward, but not in the way it usually did, not with the same rhythm of quick decisions and confident gestures, because something quieter had taken its place, something more deliberate, and Daniel felt it in the way he spoke, in the way he listened, in the way he no longer filled silence just to maintain control. And when the clients resumed their discussion, he did not lead it the way he once would have. He asked questions instead, smaller ones, precise ones, allowing space for answers to form without interruption. And even that subtle shift did not go unnoticed, because the room responded differently, less guarded, more present, as if the balance had adjusted in a way that no one needed to explain. And as the final signatures were completed and folders closed, the clients gathered their things with a quiet efficiency, offering polite nods as they left, their footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving the showroom lighter but not empty, just quieter. And Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, watching the door after it closed, not out of habit but reflection. And when he turned back, the assistant approached carefully, her posture respectful but measured. "Do you need anything else?" she asked, and the question carried more than its words. It carried awareness, and Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he replied, his voice steady, but softer than before, and she nodded, stepping away without another word, and the room settled again, not into silence, but into a different kind of presence, one that did not rush to fill itself. And Daniel moved back to the desk, his fingers brushing lightly against the surface where the folder had been, not searching for it, just acknowledging it. And his eyes drifted to the glass wall once more, the city stretching beyond it in sharp lines and moving light, unchanged, constant. And yet now he saw it differently, not as a map of transactions or listings, but as something broader, something layered, where ownership did not always announce itself, where authority did not always stand at the front of the room, and the thought did not come as a lesson spoken aloud. It arrived as a quiet understanding, one that did not need to be repeated to remain. And he stepped away from the desk, walking toward the door Naomi had exited earlier, his reflection following him in the glass. And when he reached it, he paused for just a second, his hand resting lightly on the handle, not opening it yet, just feeling the weight of the moment that had passed through it. And then he pushed it open, stepping outside into the late afternoon light, the air warmer, brighter, carrying the distant sound of traffic and voices. And he stood there, not searching for her, not expecting to see her again, but simply standing in the space where his perspective had shifted, where something he once believed to be fixed had proven otherwise. And for the first time that day, he did not try to define what came next. He allowed it to remain open, undefined. And that quiet acceptance settled deeper than any certainty he had held before, because it was not about reclaiming control. It was about understanding that control had never been what he thought it was. And as he looked out at the street, at the movement of people who carried stories he could not see at a glance, he did not turn away from that realization. He stood with it, letting it reshape the way he would move forward, even if no one else noticed the change, even if nothing about the building behind him looked different at all. The evening light settled across the block in long, quiet lines, stretching over brick and glass, over sidewalks that carried footsteps without knowing the stories behind them. And Daniel stood there a moment longer before turning back, the door closing softly behind him as he re-entered the showroom, not with the same pace, not with the same intention, but with something steadier, something more aware. And the room greeted him not with silence this time, but with a calm that felt earned, the kind that follows after something has been understood, not explained. And he walked to the desk again, not out of habit, but out of choice, placing his hands lightly on the surface, feeling the smooth edge beneath his fingertips, grounding himself in a space that no longer meant what it used to. And his eyes lifted to the glass once more, but this time he did not search for reflection. He looked through it, beyond it, at the block that had once been just listings and square footage and closing dates, and now carried something else entirely. Something he had overlooked not because it was hidden, but because he had not been looking for it. And the realization did not weigh on him the way it had before. It settled into him, becoming part of how he would see from now on. And the door behind him opened briefly, the assistant stepping in to gather a few remaining documents, her movements quiet, efficient. And when she glanced up at him, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a simple nod. And he returned it, not as authority, but as acknowledgement. And she left without a word, the door closing once again, leaving him alone with the space and the light and the understanding that had taken root there. And he reached for a pen, turning it slowly between his fingers, not preparing to sign anything, not marking a deal, just holding it, feeling its weight, as if reminding himself how easily a moment can shift, how quickly a decision can define something larger than itself. And he set it down again, carefully, aligning it with the edge of the desk, a small, precise motion that reflected something internal, something reordered. And outside, the lights along the street began to turn on one by one, soft glows appearing in windows, in doorways, in spaces that belonged to people he did not know, people he could no longer assume anything about. And he watched them, not as opportunities, not as transactions, but as reminders, each light carrying a presence, a story, a truth that existed whether he recognized it or not. And he stood there in that quiet, letting the